Continuing through the month of February, Louisville looks to handle business on the road this week.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Card Nation, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. This is my fifth year covering the University of Louisville, third year hosting this show. And I want to take the time to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, show is free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week. Your team every day. The Louisville Cardinals went 2-0 last week with wins over Boston College and Miami. They look to create an official winning streak this week, but they'll have to do it on the road. 2 games away from the KFC Yum Center, NC State and Notre Dame. Interesting matchups. 2 teams that have been on their respective declines through ACC play, but I don't think that the talent represents the record. We'll discuss why these games might be tougher than they look to be on paper. We'll give a small bracketology update. Where do the Cardinals land in some of the mainstream projections from ESPN and CBS? We'll explore that in the middle part of the show. And then to conclude, we'll dive into a weekly mailbag. Last week's mailbag was fantastic, and I like the questions that were asked in this week's edition as well. So excited to answer those coming up at the conclusion of this Tuesday edition of the show. After losing that game in early February to Georgia Tech, the Cardinals answered, winning both games last week. Huge blowout victory over Boston College up in Massachusetts, and then they returned home to the KFC Yum Center to defeat Miami by 10, despite being severely shorthanded. Chucky Hepburn didn't play. James Scott went down early with a dental issue. More on their respective availabilities coming up shortly. But Louisville goes on the road this week. Games at NC State on Wednesday, at Notre Dame for a rare Sunday matchup. 8 o'clock Eastern time up in South Bend. If you look at the ACC standings, on paper, this should be an easy week, right? And it very well could end up being, but I think it's going to be more challenging than this past week was. I know that NC State is, at the moment, the second worst team in the ACC standings. 9-14, they are 2-10 in conference play. They've, had to endure a pretty significant losing streak despite being really competitive in those games. And then Notre Dame, such a weird situation in South Bend. They're 10-13, 4-8. They kept it close and respectable against some tough teams in the non-conference schedule, but they really just haven't been able to put it together in conference play. In sort of the same situation. These losses that they've had, yes, losses in the win-loss column, but really competitive games. So I don't really look at last week against Boston College and Miami and compare it a ton to this week, because I feel like it's going to be more challenging this week. Now, Louisville is 6-2 on the road. Their 2 losses to Georgia Tech and Kentucky. They've had their fair share of blowout victories away from the KFC Yum Center. There is this narrative that they shoot better away from their home arena, and it seems like the statistics would almost suggest that. I don't have them right in front of me, but judging based upon the eye test, it seems that Louisville is a better shooting team away from the KFC Yum Center. So a team that plays better on the road, you're going up against 2 squads that are currently, as of Tuesday, in the bottom 4 in the ACC. This should be easy, right? It could be. Don't get me wrong. Louisville could, this time next week, be talking about 2 blowout victories on the road, and let's hope that that's the case. But as we saw against Georgia Tech, and I know that the Yellow Jackets then went on to defeat Clemson at Clemson, but they did lose pretty handily against Virginia this week. So if that highlights anything, it's that college basketball is completely unpredictable, especially when you go on the road in conference play. And it makes it a little bit more interesting when you're going on the road in conference play as a good team, and you're playing a team that likely isn't going to make the NCAA tournament, unless for whatever reason Notre Dame or NC State are able to win the ACC tournament, both of these teams aren't going to play in the big dance. So the next best thing is A, fighting for pride, and B, fighting to spoil the season for one of the good teams in the ACC. Like January, it was all about proving yourself. February, it's about being able to get results with a target on your back because you're playing 7 teams that you're going to be favored to beat. And you have to just continue to prove that, hey, look, we're a good team. We can handle business on the road. And that's that. Now, this week is pretty interesting because you look at NC State, and we'll have more previewing NC State on tomorrow's episode of the show. But their last win came against Notre Dame back on January 8th. January 8th. That means they have lost 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 straight games. Only one of those games, however, has been by more than 10 points. Like they have 3 losses, 10 points, 10 points, 12 points. They lost to Duke on the road by 10. They were really competitive in that game, led that game for a good amount. They lost to Clemson by 10. Again, competitive in that. They lost to California by 12 on the road. Not really a good performance there. Let's take a look at some of their other losses. North Carolina, 2-point loss. Virginia Tech, 3-point loss. California at home, 3-point loss. SMU at home, 6-point loss. Stanford, 1-point loss. So the record suggests that they're definitely not a good team, and I wouldn't argue the contrary. But this isn't going to be a cakewalk for Louisville just because of the record that you're looking at. They've kept it extremely competitive in these games. You're on the road. You're playing against a team that doesn't really have much pressure outside of maybe on Kevin Keats to keep his job. They're going to look to spoil your season. The same can be said for Notre Dame. Now, I don't think that Micah Shrewsbury is in any position to where he's on the hot seat. Short tenure up in South Bend currently. 10-13. They're 4-8 in conference play. That's currently the 4th worst in the conference. They played Creighton tough this season in non-conference play. They have double-digit losses to Houston and Georgia. But once they got into that ACC slate, I mean, double-digit loss to Georgia Tech. They lost to North Carolina by 1, NC State by 1, Duke by 8. They beat Boston College by double digits. They went on the road to beat Virginia. They beat Georgia Tech, but they lost to Miami. And then they lost to Florida State, and then they lost to Virginia Tech. So they're on a 3-game losing streak. And I'm not really going to go too much into analyzing the two situations, but I'm just trying to highlight that maybe you can consider Boston College, but they're not playing as bad as Miami is or was coming into the game. Like Miami's losses were but in blowout fashion. NC State is keeping things competitive. So make no mistake about it. The Cardinals are going to be favored to win both of these games pretty comfortably. They should. Now, looking at the injury situation at the moment, Pat Kelsey did have a little bit of an update. Basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, Chucky Hepburn remains to be day-to-day. I think that there's some optimism that he's going to play. I think that there was some optimism that he could have played against Miami if he needed to, but against the worst team in the conference, the worst team arguably in the Power Four, you shouldn't have to play him to be able to win that game comfortably. And Louisville won by 10 points. Arguably should have been more, but being able to allow him to rest in that game, you not only do that, but you give some more reps to guys like Terrence Edwards at the point guard spot. He's had to shoulder an extremely high workload this year, Chucky Hepburn has. So you give him basically a week off from gameplay, and you still win, and now you allow him to rest up for NC State. barring a setback, my intuition with no inside information tells me that Chucky is a go on Wednesday night. So that's something that you would love to see if you're a Louisville fan, obviously. And then James Scott, who exited the game in the first half because he got his two front teeth knocked back into his mouth and had to spend much of the day on Saturday in the dental chair getting some surgery. And I thought it was wild that Pat Kelsey mentioned that he had that surgery done while in his Louisville basketball uniform. Just it's one of those weird things. It's like, that's pretty interesting to me. But Pat Kelsey was optimistic that they're going to have him back Wednesday. Just got to wear that mouth guard, maybe a face mask, while the gums continue to heal. So it would be nice to have James Scott back, and it seems like all signs are pointing to Louisville having their starting big man back in the starting lineup for the game against the Wolfpack, which that's full health at the moment, right? With Case and Pryor and Corin Johnson out. So having both of those guys back would be key. This is another week in which Louisville needs to just avoid picking up any bad losses. I know that on the road against Notre Dame and NC State wouldn't really – I don't think it would be as catastrophic as losing the games against Boston College and Miami would have been. But when you look at these games for the Cardinals this week, road games, but still two quad two opportunities. So eliminating bad losses, quad two is not terrible, but you still want to bolster your resume because you saw what a Georgia Tech loss did this week. So let's take a current look at where Louisville is in the bracketology projections from both ESPN and CBS. Currently not in the greatest spot, but some room to move up in this opportunistic month of February. More on that when we come back on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. After the holiday hustle, there's nothing like giving your home a little TLC. I always find that decluttering and refreshing my space helps me get back into a routine. Whether you're tidying up, clearing out, or just want to give your space a new look to start the year, WayFair has everything you need all within your budget. I'm currently looking for furniture, and their huge selection makes it easy to find pieces that fit my style and budget. I got a couch when I moved into my house that is not really good with pets. I ended up adopting a dog, and that dog has done some damage to that couch. So WayFair has been my go-to spot to get all of my furniture needs. The free and hassle-free delivery makes it even more convenient, especially for the larger items. There's something for every style in every home. WayFair makes it easy to tackle all of your home goals that you've set for 2025. Give your home the refresh it needs with WayFair. Head to wayfair.com right now. That's WayFair.com. WayFair. Every style, every home. I know that you all feel the same when Selection Sunday rolls around and you hear Louisville's name mentioned in the field of 68. The vibes are going to be incredible. Now, it's not set in stone that Louisville is a lock, but if the Cardinals handle business, they, by all means, should be in the big dance. And just hearing and seeing the Cardinals logo pop up in that bracket it's going to be so nostalgic. And it's sad that we're talking about it like that, but it's the reality. The Cardinals haven't been in the tournament since 2019, and when they win a game, it's going to be even more sweet considering they haven't won a tournament game since Donovan Mitchell was in a Louisville uniform. Let's take a look at where the Cardinals currently sit in bracketology. Now, mind you, this episode is being recorded on Monday afternoon, so ESPN currently hasn't updated their bracketology, but with the Cardinals winning against Miami, they're net ranking not really changing much. I wouldn't imagine much changes in Joe Lunardi's bracketology that he released before the weekend. Currently, the Cardinals are a 7 seed in the Midwest Regional. That is the Indianapolis Regional. They would be in the Milwaukee pod. They would take on Texas in the 7-10 matchup, which I really don't like that potential matchup. I think that Texas is one of those teams that can beat any team in the country when they're on, and we've seen that in SEC play. Winning that game would give you the 2-15 matchup between Purdue and UNC Asheville. Purdue is another team, I feel like one of the stronger 2 seeds. They exercised some of those March Madness demons last year. So it seems like Matt Painter's team would be able to be a tough out in the month of March. So that would be a tough pod if you're the Louisville Cardinals sitting at the 7 seed. If they could just get up to the 6, they would play Drake, which that would be a brutal 11 seed. And then the 3 seed would be Texas Tech. And man, I know that we really, getting into the big dance is the main, goal, if you will. But we're also at this point where we're trying to avoid some upset potential games. So that's a pretty challenging Midwest bracket, especially with Auburn being the 1, Arizona and Ole Miss being the 4 and 5. Looking at the remainder of the bracket, this by far to me would be the most challenging of the brackets outside of maybe the East that has Duke as the 1 and Florida as the 2. But, oh well. There is a recent bracketology that was released by Jerry Palm, the expert from CBS College Hoops. He released a bracket on Monday, early on Monday morning. And he also has the Cardinals as a 7 seed. And like ESPN, they are matched up with the 2 seed, that is Purdue. Now, the 10 seed is Baylor. That's another one you're like, man, that's kind of a challenging 10 seed. So I think that the moral of the story here is let's get up from that 7 spot and rise up the ranking a little bit. But they would also be in Milwaukee. The only difference is that they would be in the South Regional with Auburn as the 1 seed, Kentucky also as the 5, and Iowa State as the 3. So another challenging situation for the Cardinals. And I think that it would get a little bit redundant talking about the path being challenging as a 7 seed because that's always going to be the case. Losing a game in the month of February when you're currently as a 7 would tank you down, I think, definitely down to the 8-9 line, maybe as a 10. So when we discuss eliminating and preventing bad losses, this is what we're talking about. Louisville was a 5 seed, and then they lost to Georgia Tech, which is a quad 2 loss. They dropped 2 whole spots. And it goes back to the perception of the ACC. It goes back to the bottom part of the conference holding the conference back. Can't really... losing in February is not going to keep you out of the tournament if you lose another game, I don't feel like. But if you're like me and you're talking about wanting Louisville to be in the most advantageous spot, you've got to get your way back up to that 5 to 6 range. And there's a question in the mailbag that sort of directly pertains to tournament seeding if Louisville was to win out. And it's a pretty interesting question because it all depends on the Cardinals' net ranking. At the moment, Louisville won over the weekend. Other teams lost. And Clemson beat Duke. So that game against Clemson is now a quad 1 win. But Louisville didn't really change in the net ranking. Like, they are still number 28. I just don't know how much further they're going to rise up with the schedule at hand. That's why it was so critical to get some of those wins in January, because when February rolls around, I mean, let's look at it. For the remainder of the season, quad 2, quad 2, quad 3, quad 3, quad 2, quad 3, quad 3. Winning these games, like if you win out, yeah, that's a different conversation. But you have so much more to lose by dropping a game than you do more to gain by winning in the eyes of the net. It's pretty clear. Now, the only argument you can make is that bracketology projections aren't final and they're not the end all be all. But sorry, I just love saying the term end all be all. You look at the net rankings, yeah, Louisville dropped 2 seeds, but they only went down 5 in the net. So would that really change things that much? That's to be determined. But it's clear to me that the Cardinals need to continue to win games and create that winning streak through the remainder of the season. So when we come back, we're going to answer some really thought-provoking questions. Some questions that it took me a while to sit there and formulate an answer to. We'll answer those questions when we come back on this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Cardinal fans, before we get into the mailbag, I do want to thank you all again for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the show is free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week, your team every day. Let's get into the mailbag. Last week's mailbag, I went on record and said that I thought it was the best one that we've had since the show was started in 2021. These questions are really good too. And the first one is pertaining to winning out. If Louisville wins out the remainder of the regular season, can they get up to the 3 seed line? Pretty interesting. Oh, that's a tough one. I do think it depends on what they do in the ACC tournament. Winning out the remainder of the games, you have 7 regular season games remaining. I don't think that alone is going to get you up to the 3 seed line. I think it's going to get you more so up to maybe the 4 or 5. But to get up to the 3, I think you need to, at the very least, win 1 game in the ACC tournament. You can make the case that you would probably need to win 2 games and make the ACC championship game. So, because that would mean that you would get likely a solid win over maybe a Clemson team or SMU or one of those squads. So, a 3 seed is really challenging to get up to at the moment. If you're playing in the SEC, feels like you could lose 4 games and rise up to a 3 seed. I'm playing, but am I? You could lose a game in the SEC and go up in the net rankings, it feels like. I really wouldn't focus on getting a 3 seed. I think getting to that 4 or 5 it should be the goal for the Cardinals. I really do. Okay, continuing on through the questions, if you had to give a percentage on how likely it is that Chucky Hepburn plays Wednesday against NC State, what would you put the percentage as? I think he's likely to play. I mean, I would say that he's not absolutely going to play. Like, it's not for sure set in stone. I would say probably 80-85%, because groin injuries can be a little tricky and they can, stick around and make things challenging. So there can always be a setback with the soft tissue injury, but I think he's likely to play. So I'm going to put them at 80 to 85%. Did you think that Clemson's win over Duke helped or hurt the Cardinals more? I mean, it helped the net ranking, I guess. It gave Louisville another quad 1 victory. In terms of the ACC standings, it didn't help. I guess it just really depends on what situation you're looking at. Like, are you looking at the ACC standings? Are you looking at tournament chances? What's the question pertaining to? Overall, I think it helped because the net rankings mean more than the conference standings. And Clemson does have more of a challenging end of the ACC slate than the Cardinals do. But you do have a situation where Clemson and Louisville are still tied at the top of the ACC in that number 2 spot. So it really, I guess, just depends on the way that you're looking at this. So, and not to mention Duke gets another loss. So, or another loss, their first ACC loss. So technically they only have one more than Clemson or I'm sorry, one less than Clemson and Louisville. So if for whatever reason, let's play the hypothetical that Duke loses another game, Clemson and Louisville win out, you have that 3-way tie. So it's going to be pretty interesting. I don't know who would get the nod in that situation, but I guess it'll be kind of neat in the name of, chaos. So yes would be my answer. Both helped and hurt, just depending on how you look at it. So it was just a good basketball game. Clemson just continues to impress me. It didn't really matter who won that game. I think Duke is a lock for a 1 seed unless they just fizzle out down the stretch, and I just don't see that being the case. So, oh well, is what it is. This is a pretty interesting question because I've seen some people talk about this on social media. Louisville doesn't seem to be playing their best ball like they were in January in the month of February. Are you worried, despite Louisville winning the last 2 games and the loss of Georgia Tech, that the Cardinals are in a little bit of a funk? I mean, I wouldn't disagree that the Cardinals aren't playing as good in the month of February as they have been in January, but they did beat Boston College by over 20 points, and they beat Miami by 10, despite Chucky not playing a single minute and James Scott playing 7 minutes. So Louisville had like a rotation of like 6 guys. I'm not really worried yet. Like, if these issues continue to be a problem, and they haven't been like damaging issues at the moment outside of the loss against Georgia Tech. And I mean, it is what it is. You lost, you didn't play well. Louisville is still doing some good things against Boston College and against Miami. If for whatever reason you lose a game this week, then I think you have a conversation. But I'm not going to create a narrative or an unnecessary trend yet to talk about until it becomes something that we have to talk about. I think that that's sort of unfair to the team, but also think it's a pessimistic way to look at things, because the Cardinals did win the past 2 games by double digits, and they had some obstacles that they had to deal with, some injuries that they had to deal with. So if Louisville goes 2-0 this week, I'm really not going to be sitting here talking about, well, they're just not playing well in the month of February when they've won 4 straight games in this respective hypothetical. So I see where the question is coming from. Like, I understand the merit behind it, and I know that it's not like malicious in the intent of the way that the question was asked. I just am not going to look at things that way unless the Cardinals start losing games, just the way that I am. So that's going to wrap up this Tuesday edition of the show. Tomorrow we will be previewing the upcoming matchup against NC State. Tomorrow is game day. Everyone have a great Tuesday. We'll see you right back here tomorrow